You're listening to Past Imperfect, a global and Indian history podcast brought to you by the Center for Wisdom and Leadership at SPJIMR. I'm Dinyar Patel. 50 years ago, India was in the grips of the emergency, an Orwellian moment when Prime Minister Indira Gandhi claimed that democracy had to be saved by suspending democracy. I'm joined by Srinath Raghavan, whose new book, Indira Gandhi and the Years That Transformed India, examines what he calls the long 1970s. This was a hinge moment in India's post-independence years, with far-reaching implications for democracy, the economy, and political practice. As Raghavan shows us, the emergency was a consequence of various crises in the long 1970s, many of them global. And these crises pushed India into a dangerous moment of untrammeled executive power, gross illegalities, and brutal state violence, which continues to haunt Indian democracy today. So, thanks, Srinath, for joining us today. You describe in your book Indira Gandhi as being a person whose rule was Caesarist. And I wonder if we can begin by defining what Caesarism was or is in modern politics and discussing what factors, both in terms of her personality and also the challenges that she encountered, that pushed Gandhi to adopt a Caesarist style.
Well, Dinyar, Caesarism is an old vocabulary in political science, political theory. I think it was prevalent until about 40, 50 odd years ago when, Marxists were still kind of engaged in characterizing different types of regimes as Caesarist. But even though the provenance is Marxist in some ways, I think it has wider purchase. The way I use the concept of Caesarism is to suggest a certain mode of politics whereby the institutional sort of circuitry of representative democracy is bypassed by a leader who is able to establish a repo outside of party and representative by parliamentary channels with the people at large, and then claims to rule by acclamation rather than simply an aggregation of votes in the sort of conventional way. Now, there were two alternatives that I had really when I was thinking about this idea of how do you characterize the particular mode of politics that Indira Gandhi inaugurates around 1969 or thereabouts. And we'll get to the circumstances in just 1 minute. So the alternatives were, what are the prevalent choices today are one is to describe these forms of politics as purely charismatic, which I think is useful. It captures one aspect of what is the politics of Caesarism or Caesarist rule. But I don't think it encompasses every dimension of it. And as I said, the desire to short circuit various kinds of party and representative mechanisms in order to establish a direct sort of connect with the people is one of the claims of Caesarist rule. And charisma certainly helps with that. But charisma, as Weber says, is not an innate attribute in politics. It is something that is retrospectively attributed to political leaders who are very successful in a highly competitive and fractured political environment. So charisma doesn't, do the trick entirely. The second alternative was a term which is very much in circulation these days, which is to refer to Indira Gandhi's style as populist. And again, the problem that I had was twofold. The first is to say that all forms of democratic politics are by definition populist because they refer to the people. Popular sovereignty is the underlying idea. So to that extent, it doesn't really tell us something very much. And in as much as the term is used, it is applied to all kinds of regimes these days. And then the prevalent kind of idea that populism draws a line between the people who are somewhat heterogeneously stitched together and the ruling elite, and that is the kind of fault line that it plays upon, doesn't really capture what Indira Gandhi was trying to do. In fact, you could say that some of the opposition to Indira Gandhi, especially under Jayaprakash Narayan, etc., had more of that kind of a populist tenor than Indira Gandhi's own rule. So which is why I felt that Caesarism was a good thing. Now, what is the context in which Caesarism is inaugurated by Indira Gandhi, and why did I find the concept useful? Right, the concept itself, if you look at it in the writings of people like Marx in the 19th century, in the context of France, but also of theorists across the political spectrum. Right, if you think about someone like Antonio Gramsci on the left, Max Weber in the center, and someone like Carl Schmitt on the right, all of them use Caesarism to refer to a form of democratic politics which tries to overcome this problem of representation, especially when universal male franchise is introduced, right? So with the advent of mass democracy, as it were, the kind of parliamentary systems that are, imagined and put into place in the 19th century have to undergo very significant changes because now the interest groups that you have to aggregate and claim to represent are very heterogeneous. And it is in that context that, the rise of these kinds of leaders who claim to have a direct connect with the people then becomes both an empirical sort of fact, which is seen in certain cases, but is also seen as desirable by people like Weber and others. Now, in the context of late 1960s, the Congress Party in India, which more or less dominates Indian politics at all levels from, say, about 1937 to 1967, for the first time in the 67 elections, the fourth general elections, receives a jolt when significant social groups actually peel away from the Congress Party and the party's own majority in parliament is reduced and its hold over several important states, especially in North India, but also in the southern state of Tamil Nadu, slips out of its grip. Now, it is in this context that the, internal crisis of the Congress Party leading up to the split of the Congress in 1969 happens. Now, Indira Gandhi adopts a Caesarist style precisely to overcome this crisis of representation that the Congress Party is facing. That fact that it cannot easily, or at least as easily as in the past, represent diverse interests and claim to speak for the nation as a whole. Right? It is in that kind of a crisis of representation that Indira Gandhi wants to overcome and surmount that the Caesarist mode is inaugurated. And it pays off very good dividends for her in the 1971 general elections when her Congress Party, Congress R, as it was called at that point of time, comes back with a thumping majority. And then, of course, the Caesarist model is cemented with the victory over Pakistan in the Bangladesh War of 1971. And then in the 1972 elections, the Congress Party has run through pretty much all the states, and whatever it lost in 67, it is able to regain to a significant measure, except in certain states. Now, what this means is that by 1972, you have a certain model of a mode of politics which could be characterized as Caesarist and is apparently very successful.
And also very different, right? From the style of rule that you had from Nehru and Shastri. You point to significant changes taking place into how politics operates in India in this period of Indira Gandhi's first years in office.
Yeah, I mean, it is different in a sense that at that point of time, even though the Congress Party was very dominant, the top leadership of the party, say Jawaharlal Nehru, for instance, willingly accepted the constraints that the party's somewhat regionalized structure imposed upon him. Right? I mean, the Congress Party was designed to be a machine for aggregating votes and power, where the regional bosses called the shots, and then there was a tiered system leading all the way up to the All India Congress Committee, the Working Committee, and then, of course, the party, Parliament, and then the government in power. All of this worked, to the extent that the top leadership was actually willing to accept that this structure needed to be maintained, and that whatever short-term constraints, it actually worked for them. Indira Gandhi, by contrast, saw all the regional leaders as her adversaries, and that was her relationship with the party bosses, who, interestingly enough, piloted her initial ascent to the prime ministerial office. But then subsequently, the relationship turned very acrimonious. And once she decided to, break the party and recast it in this highly personalized mold, then Caesarism emerges as the sort of default response that she wants to adopt.
So Caesarism is one frame which you show Indira Gandhi in light of, and the other thing you talk about in your book, of course, is this concept called the long 1970s. And I wonder if you could talk more about this concept and how it links to how global events and global politics during this period exerting a particular influence on Gandhi's prime ministership.
Right. Dinyar, as you know, one of the besetting sins of historians is that we have to historicize and we have to come up with chunks of time which are more manageable as units of analysis for us. And as with all such periodization, there is a certain kind of arbitrariness to these things. But I thought that it was eminently possible to think of the period from, say, the mid to late 1960s, circa 1967, to the mid 1980s as one unified historical period, which is to say that a historical period which has certain determinate characteristics which we can define. And I chose to call this the long 1970s because the 1970s really are the period that we are talking about, with the top and tail on either side. And I wanted to make the point that India's long 1970s was very much part of what I call the global long 1970s. And not just I, but other historians like, historians of China like Arnie Westad and Chen Jian have used this concept very well to, again, explain the evolution of Chinese politics and economy in a very similar time frame. So what are we talking about? In global terms, we are talking about this period which you could refer to for shorthand as global 1968, the period when there are sort of youth and student unrest and revolts pretty much across the world. It is happening in the context of the Vietnam War. In the United States, it's also the civil rights movements. But in the context of, say, a country like China, it is Cultural Revolution. But this is kicking off pretty much everywhere at the same time. And South Asia is very much part of the global 1968 movement. In fact, in my earlier work on the global history of the creation of Bangladesh, I pointed out that one of the countries where the global 1968 student power really had an impact was Pakistan, where actually they managed to overthrow a military dictatorship of Ayub Khan in early 1969. And you had a similar sort of moment in the context of India, which of course was linked more to an earlier moment, 1967, with 1967, when the Naxalite revolt or the communist revolt erupts in the area of Naxalbari in northern West Bengal. And that then galvanizes students who are already up in arms, both galvanized by the Vietnam War and a range of other localized kind of concerns. So you have that moment of, with a significant uprising in the mid to late 1960s. And then if you move to the early to mid 1970s, you have a moment again of a global crisis, but this time driven much more by economic and energy and environmental factors, right? I mean, which is principally to do with two things. And again, I'm using some shorthands here. The first is the United States' decision to exit the Bretton Woods system of fixed exchange rates, which means that suddenly the global economy exchange rates are gyrating, going up and down all the way, and people are scratching their heads wondering, how do we live in a world of floating exchange rates, right, where exchange rates are literally set by the markets and seem to change very often. Then in 1973, you have the Arab-Israeli War and the decision by some of the leading Arab countries, which are in OPEC, the petroleum cartel, to increase petrol prices fourfold, right? So petroleum prices actually increase by 4 times in a matter of a few months. And that sends inflation across the global economy spiraling. And that has a direct impact on countries like India, right? And then you have a similar energy and economic shock in 1979 when the Iranian Revolution happens, which then leads to another sort of oil spike with similar consequences. And then by the 1980s, all of this means that the old systems of Keynesian techniques of management of economic policy, etc., are giving way to something that we now learn to call as a neoliberal sort of set of ideas about economic management and management of the political economy, right? So this is the broad global arc of the 1970s. And I argue in the book that this global 1970s plays a very important contextual role in the way that Indian politics and political economy unfolds in the context of India's long 1970s. And that if we want to understand this period, which also conveniently for me happens to coincide with Indira Gandhi's sort of period of dominance in Indian politics, including the period when she was out of power for a few years. This period kind of fits very nicely with the global 1970s. And I argue that the global 1970s have to be taken in hand in order to explain significant changes that happened in India.
It certainly makes us think about certain crises in a very different way. I mean, you point out, for example, I think the government of India regards India as being one of the countries worst affected by the 1973 oil shock, which is something we don't tend to think of, at least when we think of certain global events like that.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, India was, as today, an important sort of importer of energy. And at that point of time, even more than just petroleum, we should remember that this is just a few years after the Green Revolution has been put into place. Now, the Green Revolution depends upon a lot of fertilizers, which also come out of petroleum products, right? And we do not manufacture those fertilizers, or at least just about setting up first fertilizer manufacturing plants in the context of India. So you're still dependent on energy imports for your food self-sufficiency. So it's as basic as that. And that has, as you say, I do quote documents and assessments from the government of India in 1975 or thereabouts, which show us very clearly what the kind of impact was on the minds of policymaking establishment in New Delhi at that point of time, and how these global events actually shaped the way that they thought about what their predicament was.
So let's begin with January 1966, when Indira Gandhi comes into power. And you describe the first few years of Indira Gandhi's prime ministership as being moments of profound crises. You have a sputtering economy, the beginnings of Naxalism, a more competitive political landscape that threatens the Congress Party's hegemony. And the main consequence of all of these crises, particularly the last, is what you describe as a casting aside of parliamentary norms and procedures. And I wonder if you could tell us a bit more about how two processes interact over here. On the one hand, you do have a deepening of democracy, right? You talk about how certain social groups are now participating in elections to a much higher degree. There's caste mobilization. And yet at the same time, you have an erosion of democratic practice.
Yeah, so 1967 is the first, seriously competitive kind of general elections. Now, it's very interesting that in none of the three elections that preceded it, the Congress Party on its own got a majority of the popular vote, so to speak, right? I mean, in a sense, they never crossed 50% vote share. But the first past the post system meant that the Congress Party was always coasting to huge parliamentary majorities, even though their share of the sort of, actual electoral vote was less than 50%. Now, this is an artifact of the first past the post system, which is a system that we adopted from the British, which actually goes back to the English Middle Ages, right? I mean, it's an archaic system of representation. Now, the 1967 elections is interesting because by the time you come to the fourth general elections, the opposition parties have figured out that a degree of unity among them could actually put the Congress Party on the defensive. And when you see that kind of push towards opposition unity in key states, especially North India, and then you have this other phenomena where significant social groups, especially what you would think of as the intermediate castes, other backward classes, groups which are so far have lent their sort of support to the Congress Party, but for a variety of reasons believe that they need to find their own avenues of access to power, direct access to power. So creation and formation of new parties by people like Charan Singh, etc., but also the rise of, say, a force like the DMK in Tamil Nadu. Right. Now, all of this means that the political landscape becomes much more competitive. And what you have is a series of coalition governments in a number of states where the Congress Party has lost its majority. Now, this leads to a period of very hectic, what you would describe as horse trading, of moving legislators from one party to another, of using various kinds of money and promises of power and wealth to get people to defect from their parties, join other parties. Then there is also an increasing sort of tendency to misuse various kinds of constitutional powers by the central government in order to, say, dismiss a government in a state or to place the state legislative assembly in abeyance or to dissolve it altogether, etc. Now, all of this is very much happening in the wake of 1967, which, as you correctly described, is a moment of democratic deepening. It's a moment of democratic, how do you put it, a learning process which is continuing. The electorate has become more aware of what the vote means and how they can use it. And it also means that the Congress Party has all of this. But at the same time, the other sort of shenanigans which are going on at the same time suggests that the rules of the game, broadly defined, of parliamentary democracy are also being slowly weakened, right? And they are being weakened precisely because the game has become more competitive. Now, again, I want to suggest that, and I want to underline this point, that this is not to draw an unfavorable comparison between some, very prim, perfect parliamentary politics in the Nehruvian period with some kind of an unruly game that unfolded subsequently. I think the prim parliamentary politics of the Nehruvian period was possible precisely because the Congress dominated politics at all levels. Politics was not competitive. Hence, it could be played according to sort of rules of the club and rules of the game, as it were. But once you come to 1967, thereafter, things start looking very different. Now, again, I want to emphasize that, when we think about rules of the game, I'm not simply referring to constitutional mechanisms and procedures, right? I mean, in order to make parliamentary politics work, you need a range of rules, norms, procedures, precedents, common understandings, willingness on the part of all parties to exercise a degree of restraint. So all of these formal and informal mechanisms together constitute and make it the game that it is. And in some ways, those who engage in that game are not only constrained by these rules, but also enabled by these rules. And the idea, as with any constitutive rules of a practice, is that over a period of time, the participants themselves kind of change the way that they think about what is it that they are playing the game for, right? So there is a certain kind of development of a certain outlook, which this kind of constitutional and parliamentary practice is supposed to bring about, just as any form of collective social practice is supposed to do. But the fact that the electorate and the electoral politics become so competitive then means that these rules increasingly come to be seen as dispensable. And as I argue in the book, that is one of the very significant ways in which the structure of Indian politics changes in this period. and with all kinds of, negative consequences for the Indian political system, even before the emergency comes along.
And completely apart from the growth of opposition politics, you, of course, have increasing divides within the Congress party. I mean, you talk about how the syndicate members of the old guard, like K. Kamraj and Morarji Desai, who had originally, of course, picked Indira Gandhi because they thought they could control her, eventually come to the conclusion that she is the biggest threat to their particular influence within the party. Why do you think they got their assessment of Indira Gandhi so wrong? And when precisely do you think the warning signs really went off in their heads?
Right. I mean, again, I think, it is one of those situations in life where, everybody underestimated Indira Gandhi until it was too late for them to do anything about correcting that mistake. And, it's actually true across the board. And I think that was partly correct because the Indira Gandhi who came to power in 1966 was very much a somewhat diffident, certainly inexperienced in policy matters. And even though she had a long sort of experience of politics coming from the family that she did and being the daughter of the first and longest serving prime minister of India, etc., she still did not kind of command the kind of weight within the Congress party that you would expect a prime minister to do when she actually became prime minister. Right. So to that extent, I think even her own view was, there was a touch of diffidence to the way that she was kind of, she saw her own situation at that moment. But I think the real warning shots start happening when Indira Gandhi actually decides to go against her own party's candidate for election as president of India. Right now, this is actually a pretty extraordinary moment. She has filed the papers for the party's official candidate, which she's bound to do as prime minister. And then she calls for a vote of confidence, etc., by all members of the party, right? Which is clearly a signal that she wants them to vote against the party's own official candidate. And that, I think, is a moment when, once again, a significant weakening of or derogation from the rules of the game of parliamentary democracy. And that then sends real shockwaves through the entire political system. And many of our opponents start waking up and smelling the coffee and figuring out that they are actually dealing with someone who is much tougher than they had bargained for.
So one particular point of contention, as you discuss in your book, is political economy. And I think in many ways, this is the most fascinating aspect of your book, and certainly for me, the most revelatory, because we tend to think of Indira Gandhi as being a dyed-in-the-wool or archetypically leftist and socialist individual. And in discussions of economic liberalization, there is some discussion, obviously, of Rajiv Gandhi, but we really think of Rao as being kind of the beginning of that moment. But you point to a much longer story over here. You show that her approach to economic matters was quite pragmatic, and she shifted quite dramatically back and forth between liberal reform and further regulation, depending on how the political winds were blowing. Is it too cynical to see her commitment to socialism as being skin deep? And how do we place her in the longer story of economic liberalization in India?
Yeah, so no, I'm glad you picked up on that as one of the important parts of the book. Frankly, those were the parts that interested me the most when I was working, simply because the materials are so rich and the opportunity for rethinking some fundamental assumptions was so enticing. And I will also say that, again, talking as a South Asian historian to another South Asian historian, I mean, modern South Asian history, I think, tends to give very little attention to economic history. I mean, you, of course, have been, studying Dadabhai Naoroji, who was at the founding moment of the study of economic history of the subcontinent. And then I would say that, in the last 40 odd years, perhaps, we have really kind of lost sight of the importance of economic history to the history of the subcontinent as a whole. I understand, there are still people who are kind of looking at it, but the dominance of other modes of thinking about our past have become so strong and prevalent in professional historiography, particularly, that I think it is important that at least some of us kind of stand apart and try and beat the drum for somewhat old-fashioned concerns. So this was very much my attempt to do what I thought was to underline very important events, right? And now, again, the broad storyline is exactly what you say, which is that Indira Gandhi goes from, one sort of end of the policy spectrum to another quite easily, when she becomes prime minister in 1966, it is very clear that there is a serious economic crisis, 2 years of drought, successive wars, etc. The planning process is kind of in tatters. So she is actually persuaded by her advisors to go in for a set of what you would think of as first steps towards economic liberalization, beginning with the devaluation. Right? These are policies urged upon the government by the World Bank, by the United States, and by her own sort of economic advisors. And she goes along with all of that. Now, that leads to a major backlash in India, political backlash, and there's a huge criticism of her as having sold out on India's economic interests, etc. There is criticism from within her own party. At the same time, she feels that the United States, the Johnson administration under President Lyndon Johnson, hasn't quite come through with the kinds of promises of aid, etc., that they had put on the table when she was agreeing to go down the stoop. So thereafter, there is a period when she is marking time. And once she decides to split the Congress party, and then she has to make this kind of a Caesarist political appeal, which is to say some kind of a dramatic, direct political appeal to the imagination of the people. That's when she embarks on this so-called kind of socialist phase of hers. And I say so-called because I do not believe it was socialist in any serious sense of the word. Now, again, let me just clarify. I mean, did Indira Gandhi believe that she cared for the poor of India? I think absolutely. But was she in any recognizable sense a socialist? I don't think so. For instance, one of the very interesting things about her is that she's very strongly opposed to organized labor in the Indian context. Right?
Brutally so.
Yeah, but at the same time, she's constantly in favor of what she calls the working poor, right? People who are not in the organized sector but very poor, right? So it's the new sort of unorganized informal sector which is coming up slowly into view, which she thinks she has to speak for, etc. Anyway, so just to say that, having set aside the question of whether she's a socialist or not, I mean, whatever her own self-conceptions, the fact is that in the period between 1969 and about, say, 73, 74, there is a sharp leftward turn in her economic policy making, right? So this is the period of all forms of nationalization, starting with the nationalization of banks, ending with the nationalization of the wholesale trade of wheat in North India, which proves to be a total disaster and has to be undone. This is also a period when, Indira Gandhi sort of abolishes privy purses and makes other kinds of statements about her progressive credentials and such like things. This is the period when the Monopolies and Restrictive Trade Practices Act comes into being. Foreign investment in India is regulated through the Foreign Exchange Regulation Act. So there is an attempt to tighten the state's grip on the big businesses. And then you could say that this is a period which, willy-nilly inaugurates a certain model of dirigism, of deepening state control, etc. But what was interesting to me, looking through the archival material that is now available to us, is how soon these attempts ran into rough weather. Already by early 1971, alarm bells are ringing within the government of India, saying that, there is a dramatic drop in the index of industrial production. We are really crawling along in terms of industrial growth. And then very soon, by 1972, 73, the specter of inflation is haunting even domestically. And then, of course, once the 73, 74 inflationary spiral takes hold, the Indian economy is really sent sort of, skyrocketing in terms of inflation. So the fact of the matter was that the global economic context and crisis meant that even this period of the, sharp kind of state control over the economy, etc., has to be willy-nilly abandoned. And by 1974, you see a series of measures that Indira Gandhi is adopting, right? She crushes the railway workers' strike. She signs a agreement with the IMF in order to sort of get a contingency loan, which means that she agrees to adopt a very strong anti-inflationary policy, right? Thereafter, macroeconomic policy remains quite conservative. That anti-inflationary policy includes things like wage freezes in terms of dearness allowance or inflationary allowance in the context of a very high inflation economy, all of which is continued through the period of the emergency. And in fact, even before the emergency, Indira Gandhi, on the advice of people like B.K. Nehru and others, agrees that some degree of undoing of this boa constrictor that they have sort of set up on the big businesses has to be done. So there is a slow, gradual, unwilling, step-by-step kind of move towards some degree of liberalization. And there is certainly a move towards favoring bigger businesses, even within the context of the Indian economy as it was constituted. Which is why the emergency is actually welcomed by much of the capitalist class in India, because it gives them a low inflation environment. It gives an environment where labor militancy is practically sort of crushed. All kinds of laws of the emergency are brought to bear like a hammer blow on the working class, organized working class particularly, which means that the industrial class actually thinks that this is a good time. So the period of 1974-75, I think, is one of, again, a significant reorientation. And much of the existing writing seems to assume that all of that only happens around 1980, etc. Whereas I do not believe that is the case, right? Now, again, I should just hasten to clarify that this does not mean that Indira Gandhi is some kind of a secret liberalizer, that she was only talking the language of socialism and doing something which is the opposite. No, I don't think so. I think she was acting under compulsions of circumstances. And what the entire sort of trajectory of Indian economic history in this period goes to show is that, whatever her own inclination, she was an extremely powerful prime minister during this period. The fact was that under the compulsion of the circumstances, the policies that she eventually adopted put India on what I described as a very long road towards liberalization, right? Again, this is not 1991. 1991 is a moment of a step change in the economic regime of India. But the consensus in terms of ideas, thoughts, etc., which needed to build up in order to lead to that point, you can already see that, starting off from 1974-75 onwards.
And you've noted, of course, that, I mean, these debates and discussions are going on while the death throes of kind of the Keynesian order is taking place. But also, so much change is taking place around India, right? I mean, you have economies like South Korea and Taiwan who are emerging as Asian tigers. And I just wonder to what degree are Indian policymakers looking at these other alternatives and other models, in countries which were as poor and as in the doldrums after World War II as India was, and wondering, of taking a second look at the particular policies that India has been implementing in terms of a planned economy. I mean, do we see people in the policymaking circles looking beyond, say, just what's going on in Europe and the United States, and looking more in the backyard?
No, I mean, honestly, I haven't come across much by way of comparative references to other East Asian countries at this point of time, right? I mean, partly because I think Indians felt that, they were in a very different kind of a mold. I mean, from the beginning, there was a commitment to building a mixed economy, where the public sector and the private sector would have an important role. So much of the debate tend to be about what should be the balance, right? Someone like P.N. Haksar, who was principal secretary to Indira Gandhi during the crucial early years, 68 to 73, and thereabouts, those 5 years. He says, and quite explicitly, that, we should be careful that we should not end up building state capitalism in the name of socialism, right? Which is exactly some variant of that is what's happening. So, but there is a huge push towards expanding the public sector enterprises in India at the same time as there is a move towards kind of gradually weakening some of the anti-business kind of policies which they themselves had legislated and put into effect. So I think much of the discussion tends to be very much centered on the peculiarities of the Indian experience itself, right? Say, for instance, one of the arguments which, especially in the early 1970s, which is made to Indira Gandhi by two sets of important advisors, I would hesitate to call them liberals in economic policy making, but nevertheless people who at least felt some qualms about the direction in which state control was going. All of them, both those sets of advisors actually write notes independently of each other, pointing out that even if you want socialism, you first need to get capitalism, right? And that's exactly the Marxist line, etc. So you see how instrumental some of this language and vocabulary has become by that time.
So let's move on to the emergency. There's obviously a lot to discuss over here, but I want to begin by looking at how Indira Gandhi consolidates executive control in the lead up to the emergency. And you talk about this in great detail in terms of the challenges that she provokes with the courts. And then, of course, once Jayaprakash Narayan takes up the student movement, there's some hard-fisted crackdowns of particular actions. And finally, of course, you have the Allahabad High Court decision, which voided her election to parliament. So, I mean, you've traced a very clear narrative of how the lead up to the emergency takes place. But I want to ask, given that Gandhi is a Caesarist politician, and given in particular her paranoia, to what degree can we see the emergency as being perhaps a little bit premeditated? I mean, does it fit into a much longer story of her confrontation with the judiciary? And, is it possible to see it as kind of an inevitable result of the type of politics and political struggles that she's waging?
No, I think that's a great question, and in some ways goes to the heart of what I think is the sort of central question of the emergency, or rather, what are the central questions of the emergency, right? Because as I see it, a lot of both academic work and popular discussions down to the present tend to operate on what were in trying to uncover what exactly were Indira Gandhi's intentions in imposing emergency, right? Her own claim was that the country faced a very serious internal threat and that the opposition sort of forces on the ground were being supported by powers from outside in order to destabilize and overthrow her elected government. And that in order to save democracy, she had to more or less suspend it, right? I mean, that is the claim. And frankly, that's a claim she stuck to pretty much till the end of her life. You can see interviews of hers on YouTube at various stages of her career saying pretty much the same set of things. Now, the Shah Commission, which was a commission of inquiry constituted by the Janata government after her ouster from power in 1977, quite explicitly sort of rubbishes all of these claims and shows quite rightly that there is very little evidence to support that there was any such serious threat. There was no such assessment prepared by any of the agencies, etc. Right? And I think my own research supports that conclusion, and I do believe that this was an excuse rather than a real sort of question out there. Now, having said that, you can look at other reasons why Indira Gandhi decided to impose emergency. And the proximate, I think the most important reason is the desire to protect her own control over power and her position in office, which has been kind of put into jeopardy by the Allahabad High Court judgment of 12th of June 1975. Subsequently, she appeals to the Supreme Court, but the Supreme Court gives her a conditional kind of stay, which means that she can continue as prime minister but cannot act as an MP, right? So it's a kind of anomalous position. The opposition sort of hits the streets with the demand that she should go and that she has to resign, etc. So as I see it, the proximate, immediate, motivation for imposing the emergency was Indira Gandhi's desire to continue and secure her hold in office as prime minister. By invoking the emergency power, she could, in one stroke, put all of the opposition in jail, could muzzle the press and make sure that no organized opposition against her rule and power could continue for at least a while. Now, that is exactly what the emergency tried to do it. And then I think the desire to protect her office is also quite evident if you look at the first sets of constitutional amendments which were made during the emergency, all of which had successively layered provisions to fortify the prime minister's position from any kind of challenge in the courts of any kind, right? I mean, it's actually hilarious the extent to which they went to cement it. And Indira Gandhi also secures a favorable verdict from the Supreme Court on the particular case where the Allahabad High Court had convicted her. So all of that is done. So that to me is very clear that that's it. But the point is that, we cannot explain or causally explain the onset of something like the emergency purely by looking at what Indira Gandhi wanted. Because it begs the question then of saying that even if someone wanted something, how did they manage to get it? After all, you had a political system which was designed not to allow such things to happen, which was supposed to operate on very different principles of differentiations of power and functions, of various kinds of checks and balances. There were various kinds of freedoms that were constitutionally guaranteed. So how do we get to a point where, Indira Gandhi actually manages to achieve what she wants? And in order to do that, I think it's very important to take two things into view. One we've already discussed, which is the kind of loosening of the rules of the game kind of story, right? Which is a story where it is not just Indira Gandhi who does not believe in the value of democracy. And I actually quote an interesting letter that she writes to Yehudi Menuhin saying pretty much this in explicit terms. But also the opposition parties who believe that, it doesn't matter whether a government is legitimately elected, etc. If they feel that it has lost legitimacy, it should go, right? I mean, which again calls into question what exactly are the constitutive rules of the game. But the second aspect, which actually enables causally, so to speak, the emergency to happen, is this kind of extreme sort of shift in the relative balance of power towards the office of the prime minister, right? Now, that happens in the first instance because, Indira Gandhi's electoral victory, splitting of the party and electoral victory in 1971 and 72 means that she has complete control over her Congress party, which is also the dominant force in parliament and which is also the dominant force now in the states, which means that she has complete control over parliament, not just for normal legislative processes, but potentially also for constitutional amendments, some of which also require the concurrence of state legislatures, or a certain number of state legislatures. So that entire sort of, balance of power has shifted both from the cabinet and from parliament towards the office of the prime minister. And then in 1973, as you correctly note, she supersedes the senior most judges of the Supreme Court and appoints a more pliable candidate as the Chief Justice. And that enables, that pays off well when her case comes up for hearing in the Supreme Court after the Allahabad High Court nullifies her election to Parliament in 1975. So, as I see, these two changes, which are antecedent or which happened before the emergency are imposed, are absolutely essential to understand how the emergency actually happened, right? Because in a sense, the emergency was not inevitable, but once the Allahabad High Court decision happened, and Indira Gandhi decides that she wants to do this in order to save her own position, then something like the emergency becomes unavoidable. Unavoidable in the sense that the conditions that should have been present in order to prevent something from happening are no longer available, right? So it is that kind of a way in which I think we should understand what the causal importance of these kinds of prior changes were, which I characterize as systemic changes, because they are deep changes to the system of politics. And it's not just about the personality or the insecurity of Indira Gandhi, right? And Indira Gandhi was insecure about her position. You could say that she was paranoid, but then as Henry Kissinger, who's one of her sort of people she didn't like very much, Henry Kissinger once said that even the paranoid have real enemies, right? I mean, and I think that's true. So I think everything cannot be boiled down to purely her paranoia, and we have to take into account these broader shifts.
One other thing that you talked about during the emergency, which in particular caught my attention, were discussions of how she was thinking of actually retooling the constitution in such a way to institute a French-style presidential system modeled on de Gaulle's Fifth French Republic. And concurrently with this, how many Congress Party sycophants even wanted her appointed for life as an executive leader. Can you discuss these proposals a bit more, and also how they fit into a broader tapestry of democratic disillusion that you see by this point in the 1970s in India?
Yeah, so, already from the early 1970s, there are these periodic discussions that maybe, we made a mistake in choosing the parliamentary system, because there's just too much instability of governments, and the prime minister's authority tends to get weakened, etc., etc. Right? I mean, so there are these stray kind of thoughts which are floating principally by jurists and other people who are interested in these matters. But once the emergency comes into play, then there is a significant sort of view from some of the advisors who are very close to her, starting with B.K. Nehru, who's actually the High Commissioner in London at that point of time, but who nevertheless writes to her, commending the French model and saying that what you need is a directly elected executive presidency, right? Which is not bound to parliament and which can appoint prime ministers. I mean, the French Republic model is exactly what he says, with some safeguards, needs to operate in the context of India. That is the only way that we can, overcome all of these kinds of crises. And remember that at that time, the larger crisis that people had was not just about popular unrest and politics, but also the economic crisis, the global economic crisis. How do you sort of get a grip on this entire situation? You need a powerful, right? And again, why does Indira Gandhi get attracted to her? Because if you think about it for just a minute, it is obvious that a directly elected executive presidency is the institutional analog of what I've called Caesarism, right? In that sense, the American presidency is actually the first instance of an institutionalized Caesarism. And you can see how that plays out in today's context, for instance, but we'll bracket that question. So to get back to the mid-1970s in India, so there is a huge demand that, this should happen. And then there are various kinds of proposals being drafted by, senior leaders of the Congress Party. I know these are not people to be sort of discarded as purely kind of functionaries or sycophants. I mean, they were sycophantic, but they were powerful sycophants within the party structure. But they overreach when they try to leak some of these proposals to the press. And then Indira Gandhi says, let's get what needs to be done in order to secure our interests, which, as I say, are then lead to the sort of most important sets of constitutional amendments, which are brought in. And those are very far-reaching amendments, which actually upset the entire kind of constitutional structure, right? The 42nd Amendment particularly. And then what that amendment does to do is broadly three things. So the first is to make sure that Indira Gandhi's own position as prime minister is unchallengeable in any court of law or any kind of electoral law rather. So that is done. The second thing which is done is to entrench the imbalance of power between the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary, right? And it is seen as basically under the garb of saying that parliamentary supremacy has to be established because parliament represents the people, so it's people supremacy. So the courts are entirely sort of to be defanged in terms of their constitutional role of judicial review, etc. And the third thing which happens is that the central government tries to arrogate many more powers within the sort of quasi-federal structure which India was against the states, right? So there is this kind of fundamental sort of imbalance which is bought by these amendments. And Indira Gandhi doesn't really sort of think too much about the presidential system. But again, when she comes back to power in the 1980s, there is once again talk of saying that, given all the kinds of crises that are kicking off at that point of time in Assam, Punjab, Jammu and Kashmir, etc., shouldn't we need a presidential system, etc.? And again, there are interesting voices within the Congress party which actually make the case for such things.
And placing Rajiv as prime minister at the same time, right? I mean, that was another kind of eye-opening moment.
Yeah, I mean, that is an interesting because there is a moment when when the president of India's term comes to an end and Indira Gandhi has to nominate as prime minister or decide who's the person to be elected as the next president. And apparently for a couple of weeks, she very seriously contemplates, that she should herself become president and perhaps hand over the reins of the party and government, executive government, so to speak, to Rajiv Gandhi, who's a son, right? I mean, which would have been, I feel, an interesting fusion of Caesarism and dynasticism. I mean, who knows? Maybe we've not seen the last of all of that yet, at least in non-Indian contexts, certainly. But yeah, so there is a consistent sort of dissatisfaction with all of this, precisely because she feels that what India needs is a very strong executive. I mean, that's the fundamental instinct, which I think is very strongly ingrained within her.
And in many ways, that discussion doesn't go away, right? I mean, I recall posters in Mumbai as recently as 10 or 15 years ago saying start a presidential system. So, I mean, you've had a very popular constituency for that. And I guess, over the past few years also, we've had that in fact, right? I mean, with the entrenchment of executive authority.
Yeah. And again, Dinyar, I would just say that, this phenomenon, which political scientists who have studied other parliamentary democracies like Britain refer to as the presidentialization of parliamentary systems, right? And that, again, is a very consistent feature of many parliamentary systems in the long 1970s, because all of them are facing similar kinds of pressures. So India, because of the emergency, tends to be seen as an outlier, as someone who abandoned democracy. But we should remember that practically every democratically elected government, including, so to speak, older democracies in the West, were on the ropes in the long 1970s, precisely because of the economic crisis of the period. I mean, hardly any democratic government got re-elected. And so this form of presidentialization is become, and that's, if you look at even, say, Indian politics today, right? I mean, the way that even chief ministers operate in states, let alone how national level politicians try to protect themselves. There is a very clear sense that, somebody has to be the chief executive officer of the government, right? And that's the way that this show has to run. And so I think that is a legacy which we have not yet lived down.
So your account of the emergency is quite sobering to read. I mean, you talk about family planning, you talk about slum demolitions, the arrests of hundreds of thousands of people, crackdowns on labor. The question I'm going to ask you is, I know something which one could talk about for many minutes, but we'll try to keep it brief. What do you believe is the most pernicious aspect of the emergency?
Well, I mean, see, the emergency is a period of direct and avowed authoritarian rule, right? And I think that aspect needs to be stressed very clearly, because I understand, especially in the current context, there is a constant tendency to keep saying that, we may be in a sort of an emergency without declaring an emergency kind of situation, etc. And I actually think that does disservice to that historical episode between 1975 and 1977, when pretty much the fundamental rights were set aside. And, things could be done which were inconceivable in other contexts. And again, there is always a lot of popular memory around forcible sort of, vasectomies and population control methods, which were highly coercive. There's slum demolition, which was again very coercive. But, just ask the question, how was it possible that these things could be done by a government? If in normal circumstances, any government were to attempt such a thing, you would imagine that the first recourse that the people have is to some constitutional court. It would be a high court or a Supreme Court. But under the emergency, the recourse to the courts was simply taken away. And that is what is the background condition that enables all of this other highly coercive things to unfold. So as I see it, I mean, the coercive aspect of the emergency is a consequence of a period of very clear, avowed dictatorial rule. And I think that aspect of it needs to be borne in mind, because I think we tend at times to, get ourselves into a tangle trying to figure out whether the present period actually resembles emergency or not, which I think is a bit of a futile debate, because what it does is to actually lead to a view of the emergency which perhaps isn't quite accurate. I mean, this was an extremely traumatic time for Indian democracy.
So let's move towards the end of the emergency. By late 1976, you describe how there are discussions about holding elections and ending the emergency. There was a feeling that the emergency was having dwindling advantages for keeping an emergency going on. And finally, of course, Indira Gandhi does do this. She ends the emergency in January 1977. But you mention in your book that her precise motives for ending the emergency and calling for elections remain a mystery and may have, as you say, been, quote, inscrutable to the Prime Minister herself. Could you discuss that a bit more?
Yeah, no, I mean, so first of all, I mean, in purely sort of empirical terms, I haven't come across any piece of evidence which is a smoking gun which lays out what exactly were the reasons that Indira Gandhi felt she had to call the emergency. Perhaps such piece of or pieces of evidence do not exist at all, because it seems to have been the outcome of several kinds of deliberations which were already beginning from early December 1976. Yeah, so and the elections are announced in January 1977. And as I say in the book, I mean, the best proxy that we have to understand what was framing her thinking are these assessments, which are prepared for the prime ministers, many of which are very lengthy, 40-odd pages long, which point out that the emergency regime had certain kinds of advantages which it delivered for the government and the people in terms of, low inflation, political stability, etc. I mean, by their reckoning, which they feel are kind of tapering off, and that before the residual sort of public support for some of these things evaporates, it is better to kind of go into election mode and regain a mandate. There is also a political calculation of a more straightforward variety, which is that because the opposition leaders are either in jail or under heavy surveillance, they are able to intercept all the communications between them. So the government knows that the opposition is making efforts to unite, come together, coalesce perhaps as one political party, and that they were, however, having very difficult time doing that because of differences between various constituents, the old Congress, the socialists, the Janasangh, and so on. All of them were pulling in different directions. So there is a feeling within the government that it is better to call the elections while the opposition is still divided, because if the opposition is divided, the benefits of the first past the post system would fall on the Congress party, which might come back with reduced but nevertheless still a majority in parliament, and you could continue the show. So those, I think, were really the sort of ways in which it happened. And as I said, Indira Gandhi herself seems to have been very conflicted about a range of things, right? Because on the one hand, she understands the logic of some of these things, but at the same time, in November 1976. She also extends the term of the parliament by one full year. She gets the parliament to extend it itself, right? Which suggests that, perhaps she was not so inclined, after all, to call immediately for elections. So, as I said, I mean, it is a bit of an inscrutable kind of moment on what exactly were the reasons that she did. And then again, I mean, we can continue to speculate this till we have some more serious evidence, perhaps emerging from other kinds of private papers that she has left behind.
So the emergency, of course, ends with her being trounced at the polls in March 1977 and the first non-Congress government led by the Janata Party coming to power. You paint a very sorry picture of the Janata Party. You describe it as, quote, marred from the get-go by the grotesque ambition of elderly men who saw a belated opportunity to shin up the greasy pole, end quote. Was the Janata Party government doomed from the start, or were their roads not taken?
Well, I mean, see, their situation was difficult from the very start because, they came to power, in a context which was very unpredictable. It was something of a shotgun marriage to bring all of the constituent sort of elements of the Janata Party together. They couldn't even manage to get a party organization structure in place. They were even as soon as the election verdicts turned in, various kinds of contenders for the office of prime minister, various important posts, many egos had to be massaged and soothed, and many kinds of differences. So there were personality differences, there were ideological differences, there were serious differences between constituents of, some of the more left-wing elements of the Socialist Party, for instance, were very strongly opposed to the presence of people from the RSS background in the Janasangh. Others, like Atal Bihari Vajpayee from the Janasangh, felt that was an issue which could be managed. But then there were others like Charan Singh, who had his own ambitions and felt that he and his sort of followers were being given short shrift, even though they were perhaps the backbone of the Janata Party in key northern Indian states. So all of this meant that you had a very difficult kind of coalition to go with. There was no prior experience of doing this at the national level. Let's recall that this is the first time there is a change of government in terms of Congress Party being voted out at the national level itself. And then you have an economic situation which remains bad. In fact, we still tend to forget the fact that it is in the last months of the Janata sort of government that the second oil shock of 1979 actually hits. And Morarji Desai, who's otherwise a reasonably competent economic administrator, actually has a lot of experience of these matters, presides over an economy which has negative 6% GDP growth. It's the sharpest contraction of the Indian economy in the 20th century. So the Janata Party is also it also has to face up to circumstances which are very difficult. And as I said, then there were some highly misguided priorities, one of which was to ensure the political sort of oblivion of Indira Gandhi. I mean, I think they feared her so much that they could only rest at ease if she was hounded out of the political scenario, which led them to do all kinds of things which can only be described as foolish. And not even with the benefit of hindsight. I mean, even at that point of time, there are people within the Janata Party who are writing to the government saying, why are you trying to arrest Indira Gandhi? You're giving her the best platform ever to come back into public consciousness, right? And similarly, they oust her from parliament on very sort of tenuous grounds, and only then leading her to sort of, cut the figure of martyrdom and once again split the Congress Party and then rally forces around her and so on. And then, of course, the ambition of people like Charan Singh, which she stokes, knowing full well that she will never allow them to be succeeded. So this is indeed a sorry tale. But having said that, I hope I haven't painted an entirely one-sided picture of Janata, because I do believe that the Janata government had some very serious accomplishments as far as Indian democracy was concerned, because they did undo some of the most serious constitutional damage which was done by the emergency regime through particularly the 42nd Amendment. And they did try to put some of those pieces back in place. So some of the sort of entrenched balance of power, in the office, in the executive, etc., was undone, though the executive still remained quite powerful and remains till date. But at the same time, for instance, the Janata government and its leaders were also totally oblivious of the fact that in some ways they themselves had also been complicit in the erosion of what I described as the rules of the game, which is the other major problem there. It's not just imbalances of structural power, but also of how the system plays as a whole. And they themselves were totally oblivious of their rule, and in some ways continued to derogate, say for instance, by dismissing Congress governments in states which had been elected on the grounds that the general election showed that they had no legitimacy left. Right? And so when you start doing those kinds of things, you are totally unaware that in some ways the damage which was done to the system by your own hands also has to be rectified. So I don't think there was that kind of a deep reckoning really with what happened during the emergency.
There's so much more to talk over here about particularly towards the end of the book, Indira Gandhi's return to power and such. But for the interest of time, I want to conclude with two questions. And the first goes to a comment that you made in passing, where you talked about how the Janata Party can't just be seen as a sorry tale. But reading your book, one gets the sense that there is a very sorry tale to be told here, right? That it's not just Indira Gandhi who is making decisions which are motivated by power and in some cases paranoia or Caesarism, as you described, but so many other characters acting in a way which degrades the whole system and causes this crisis not just in Indian democracy but the rules of the game and just a general erosion in norms and quality of democracy at the time. Is it an accurate picture to portray over here, kind of like 1,000 cuts on Indian democracy taking place at this moment?
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I think that systemic shift which happened in the long 1970s and whose consequences we have lived with ever since, is, I think, at least to my mind, undeniable, as is the very general sort of complicity of the entire Indian political elite in doing these kinds of things, including people whose personal moral qualities were impeccable. People like Devaprakash Narayan, for instance, avowed and insisted on certain courses of action, which only ended up kind of eroding the rules of the game and the normative framework within which this entire thing, whatever be the sort of other kinds of points and the validity that you're making, right? So here is an Indian political elite, which is very generally complicit in the erosion of the constitutive rules of the game of parliamentary democracy, as I see it. So, which is why I feel that the best historical verdict in retrospect is to borrow the closing lines from Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, where the prince says, "All are punished." And I think that's exactly what happens. I mean, practically every dramatis personae in this story ends up in some ways facing some form of political defeat or the other.
And the last question for you takes us back to this question of Caesarism. So we began by talking about the elements of Caesar's rule in Indira Gandhi's prime ministership. But to what degree do we see a return of Caesarism today? And how is the style of populist authoritarianism, whether it is that of Narendra Modi, Donald Trump, Erdogan, or so many other leaders that have been in power for the past decade or so, to what degree is their rule similar and different from the type of Caesarism that you describe in your book with Indira Gandhi?
Right. We'll need a full podcast to sort of actually handle that question. But
yes,
in the interest of time, let me just say this. First of all, that I do believe, and here I'm speaking just as an informed layperson rather than a political scientist or something, which I'm not, that there are significant differences even between these various current sort of, political leaders and governments and styles of doing things, right? I don't think, which is why I'm hesitant to employ the term populist, because I actually think it's something of a grab bag, which doesn't really give us much by way of to go precisely, right? But at the same time, you have to understand that whatever the kind of strong executive authority that, say, someone like Mr. Modi exudes in the Indian context, and again, the balance of power, which began to be tilted towards the executive back then, is still now in the context of even a government which doesn't have a parliamentary majority, still seems pretty strong. That only goes to show that those are somewhat entrenched features of our thing. So he's a beneficiary really of some of the changes which happened early on, as have been other prime ministers in the past, right, including those who led coalition governments. But I think there are significant differences. For instance, Mr. Modi has a party and a cadre-based machinery of a kind that Indira Gandhi never had. Even during the emergency, it's very interesting if you look at it. Much of the programs of the emergency, the propagandizing, etc., is being done by the bureaucracy. The Congress party, as one of the notes which is prepared for her says quite bluntly, is actually sleeping throughout the emergency. They are doing nothing. Yeah, even someone like Sanjay Gandhi, is supposedly seen as a driver of various kinds of, misdeeds during the emergency, all of which is true, never really had that much of machinery behind them. I mean, the Youth Congress was frankly a bit of an overblown joke and, didn't quite manage to do anything on the ground which justifies the kind of claims that they were making on their behalf. So as I see it, I mean, those are very significant differences between, say, the kind of rule and models of rule that we see in India today from what happened during the emergency, right? And I think that's important. And which is why, again, if you take a figure like, say, Gramsci, whom we referred to earlier on, right, who's one of the sort of main theorists of Caesarism. See, for Gramsci, Caesarism is just one response to what he says is a crisis of representation, or what he calls a crisis of hegemony, right? So you could have other kinds of responses. So he says Caesarism is one response. There's something called a passive revolution, which is a coalition between elite social groups, which is another response. And the third response he says is fascism, right? So for Gramsci, I mean, there is a spectrum of responses which is possible. So I do not necessarily think that what we're seeing today is Caesarism of the Indira Gandhi variety, right? I mean, there are significant differences in play.
So Srinath, thanks so much for joining us today. Your book provides sober reading, but I think extremely important reading. And I really want to thank you for taking the time out in order to discuss your research and your findings on the long 1970s and Indira Gandhi's rule.
Thank you, Dinyar. This was a very interesting conversation. Thanks for reading the book and asking all of these very probing questions.